My beloved friends, tonight I stand before you to reveal something so simple, yet so powerful, it can shift the entire atmosphere of your home. It's not hidden in the mountains, nor buried deep beneath the sea. It's something you touch every day, something so common, yet divinely charged: salt. Yes, salt. That humble grain that seasons our food, preserves our meals, and yet holds within it a mystery of heaven's abundance waiting to be unlocked. Salt has always carried a sacred significance throughout history, not merely as a seasoning for food, but as a divine symbol of purity, preservation, and covenant. In ancient times, salt was more valuable than gold because it represented something eternal. It never decayed, never lost its essence, and never surrendered to corruption. Spiritually, it mirrors the nature of divine truth, which endures through every trial, every generation, and every storm of life. When you look at salt, you are not simply seeing a mineral, you are beholding a reflection of God's own character, pure, steadfast, unchanging. Salt in the scriptures often symbolized the covenant relationship between God and his people. When he said, "You are the salt of the earth," it was not just a poetic phrase, it was a divine assignment. To be salt means to carry purity into impure environments, to preserve what is good in a decaying world, and to represent a life that stands firm in holiness and truth. The presence of salt in a home or a life declares that what is inside will be protected, preserved, and purified by divine power. It signifies that corruption cannot enter where salt stands guard, for salt is the mark of sanctification. In the physical realm, salt keeps food from rotting, and in the spiritual realm, it keeps the heart from corruption. That is why placing salt in a sacred place of your home carries a prophetic meaning. It becomes more than an act of tradition, it becomes an act of faith, declaring that your household will be preserved from spiritual decay and financial dryness. Salt becomes a visible symbol of purity guarding the unseen forces around you. It whispers to the heavens that this home belongs to divine order, not chaos, to light, not darkness, to abundance, not lack. It is a covenant between the seen and the unseen, between the believer's faith and God's unchanging promise of provision. Salt also reminds us that prosperity without purity will not last. True abundance flows only through clean channels. When you place salt with faith, you are not just calling for wealth, you are inviting divine order to cleanse the roots of your prosperity. It aligns your material blessings with spiritual truth so that nothing in your success carries corruption. Just as salt mingles quietly with food yet transforms its taste, so God's presence works silently in your home, transforming the atmosphere from lack to plenty, from fear to faith, from dryness to divine overflow. The home is not merely a physical structure made of bricks, walls, and windows, it is a spiritual environment that absorbs the thoughts, emotions, and faith of those who dwell within it. Every word spoken, every prayer uttered, every act of love or fear releases energy that shapes the atmosphere of that home. When faith and action meet within the home, something supernatural begins to happen. The unseen realm responds to the alignment of belief and obedience, and divine energy starts to flow through the place like a river of light. This is the essence of spiritual balance, where the physical becomes a vessel for the divine, and the invisible presence of God fills every corner, bringing peace, harmony, and prosperity. When a person intentionally sanctifies their home, they are not only cleaning the visible space but also restoring the spiritual order that allows divine blessings to dwell freely. Faith is the key that opens the flow, but action is the hand that turns it. You can believe all you want, but unless you act upon that belief, the energy remains dormant. That is why the placement of salt, when done in faith, becomes more than a symbolic gesture, it becomes a spiritual act of connection. Salt, as a conductor of divine purity, interacts with the energy of the home, pushing away stagnation, confusion, and negativity, making room for divine increase. When faith charges that simple act, it becomes a channel for the invisible power of heaven to manifest visibly in your life. Throughout the pages of history, God has always delighted in using the simplest and most ordinary things to display his extraordinary power. He spoke through a rod in Moses' hand, multiplied a widow's jar of oil, and turned a small boy's lunch into a feast for thousands. This is the nature of the divine, to take what seems insignificant in human eyes and transform it into a vessel of miraculous change. Salt, though small and common, carries this same mystery. It appears ordinary, yet when touched by faith, it becomes a conduit for supernatural manifestation. The power is not in the salt itself but in the divine principle it represents, the truth that God works through what we already have when we believe in what He can make it become. Many people wait for something grand to happen before they believe, but God's ways are hidden in the humble. He hides His miracles in plain sight, within the small actions and simple objects that we often overlook. When a believer takes something as ordinary as salt and dedicates it with faith, that moment becomes sacred. Heaven does not respond to the object but to the belief behind it. The natural substance becomes a point of contact between human faith and divine power, and through that connection, transformation flows into every area of life. Salt reminds us that nothing is too simple to carry divine significance. In the same way that it seasons food, faith seasons our actions, turning them from empty rituals into living expressions of trust. The ordinary becomes extraordinary when faith breathes upon it. When you place salt in a sacred place within your home, you are performing a prophetic act that declares, "I believe God can use even this to release His blessing." It is not the size of the action that moves heaven but the size of the faith that empowers it. In moments of obedience, the natural and the supernatural intertwine. What seems small in your hands becomes mighty in God's. Just as the widow's little oil did not run out, your simple act of faith will not go unnoticed. The salt, a common household element, becomes a divine symbol of transformation. It teaches that you do not need something rare or costly to attract God's power, only a willing heart, a believing spirit, and a simple act done in faith. When faith meets simplicity, miracles are born, and the ordinary becomes the stage for God's extraordinary abundance to unfold. Every home carries a spiritual rhythm, a sacred pulse that reflects the faith, harmony, and atmosphere of those who dwell within it. There exists within every home a sacred place, a space that holds more than furniture and decoration. It holds spiritual energy, unseen yet powerful, shaping the flow of peace, health, and prosperity. This sacred place is not defined by luxury or beauty, but by the divine presence that abides there. It may be a quiet corner where prayers rise, a simple shelf where light touches the morning air, or a small space where hearts have connected with God in faith. Wherever faith has been planted, that place becomes a meeting ground between heaven and earth. When you find that sacred place in your home and honor it, you are not performing a ritual, you are recognizing divine order. The presence of this place invites you to connect with spiritual energy intentionally, not casually. It is the altar of your home, the silent witness of your prayers, and the gateway through which blessings enter. The sacred place is where human effort surrenders to divine influence. It is where your faith touches the atmosphere, commanding peace over chaos, and abundance over lack. When you stand there and act in faith, placing salt as a prophetic symbol, you are declaring that this ground is consecrated, that nothing unclean or negative may rule over it. This sacred place serves as a channel through which divine prosperity flows into every other room. Just as a river begins from a single source and flows outward, the energy of blessing begins from this sanctified space and spreads throughout the home. Many live in houses filled with material possessions but empty of spiritual peace because they have not dedicated a space for divine communion. When a home is spiritually aligned, prosperity becomes natural. The air feels lighter, the environment becomes receptive, and the energy shifts from struggle to serenity. Finding this sacred place is not about superstition but about spiritual awareness. It is recognizing that your home is not just a shelter but a sanctuary. It carries the vibration of your faith, and when you create a place that honors God's presence, you give the divine permission to dwell fully among you. The sacred place is where divine energy begins to move, where the unseen becomes tangible, and where the promise of prosperity finds its doorway. Through that single point of faith, blessings are invited to multiply, and your entire home becomes a vessel of divine abundance. The act of placing salt in a sacred place within your home is far more than a physical gesture, it is a prophetic action that carries deep spiritual symbolism. Salt, by its very nature, purifies and preserves. When used with faith, it becomes a tool through which the divine presence cleanses the atmosphere and establishes a covenant of prosperity. In the spiritual realm, every object can carry intention, and salt, when placed with prayer, becomes a declaration that your home is a place of divine order, free from stagnation, confusion, and lack. It represents the cleansing of the old energy that may have blocked financial flow and the opening of new channels of abundance. The placement of salt, therefore, becomes a prophetic invitation for renewal and restoration. When you place salt in faith, you are not worshipping the salt itself but activating a divine principle. It is the faith behind the act that unlocks its power. This prophetic act symbolizes the removal of unseen burdens that have weighed your household down, be they financial blockages, emotional heaviness, or negative influences. The salt absorbs what is impure and sanctifies what is clean. It reminds the atmosphere that your home belongs to divine authority, not to disorder. The moment you set it in a sacred place, you are proclaiming a new season, one where divine prosperity replaces lack, and divine peace replaces worry. The spiritual world responds to symbolic obedience. When God instructs simple actions, they carry supernatural results because they express trust. Placing salt becomes an outward sign of inner faith. It is saying, I believe that divine purity reigns here, and no spirit of scarcity will rule over my home. The prophetic act becomes a seal of covenant between your faith and God's promise to bless the work of your hands. It declares that financial doors long shut will now open, that lost opportunities will be restored, and that the flow of blessing will move unhindered through every area of your life. Faith-filled declaration is the breath that gives life to every spiritual act. Without words spoken in belief, even the most sacred actions remain incomplete. The universe was created through the spoken word, and that same creative power resides in the mouth of every believer. When you speak faith over what you do, you are not merely uttering words, you are shaping reality. The act of placing salt in a sacred place becomes powerful only when your tongue aligns with your belief. As you declare words of blessing, you activate the energy of faith that transforms the atmosphere around you. Every word carries vibration, and faith-filled speech releases divine frequency that invites prosperity, healing, and peace to dwell in your home. When you speak over your actions, you are commanding the unseen to respond. The spiritual world listens to sound more than sight, and your words become the tools that direct its flow. As you place the salt, it is not enough to hope silently, your declaration must accompany your action. Speak with authority, declaring that your home is blessed, your finances are increasing, and your environment is purified by divine power. These are not empty affirmations but spiritual decrees backed by the creative force of faith. When you speak with conviction, your words pierce through the invisible barriers that hinder progress, breaking every limitation and opening the way for abundance to manifest. Faith-filled declaration is not about repeating phrases, it is about aligning your heart, your thoughts, and your voice with divine truth. When you speak, you must believe that what you declare is already set in motion. The moment your words are released, divine energy begins to organize circumstances in your favor. Angels respond to faith-filled speech because it carries the vibration of heaven's authority. The atmosphere of your home begins to change as your words fill it with faith, replacing doubt with confidence and fear with assurance. There is creative power in the mouth of the believer, and when that power is directed with intention, it reshapes both spiritual and material reality. Declaring blessings over your home as you perform the prophetic act of placing salt transforms a simple action into a divine covenant. The salt becomes a witness to your words, a silent testimony of your faith. Each declaration establishes spiritual laws that guard your finances, attract divine opportunities, and sustain peace within your walls. When faith and word unite, the supernatural becomes visible, and what was once impossible begins to unfold naturally. Through faith-filled speech, your home becomes an echo of divine prosperity, resonating with the sound of blessings waiting to be fulfilled. The law of divine multiplication is one of the most beautiful and mysterious principles of the spiritual realm. It teaches that when you obey in small things, heaven responds with great abundance. God never overlooks a humble act of faith, instead, He magnifies it beyond human measure. The story of multiplication runs throughout the scriptures, the little boy's lunch feeding thousands, a handful of flour sustaining a family, or a mustard seed growing into a great tree. Each miracle began with something small placed in God's hands, followed by obedience and belief. This is how divine multiplication works. What you release in faith never returns the same, it always comes back increased, expanded, and overflowing. When you perform a prophetic act like placing salt in your sacred space, it may seem like a minor action, but in the eyes of heaven, it carries immense spiritual weight. The act itself becomes a seed of obedience, and every seed, when sown in faith, attracts the law of increase. The moment you obey with a believing heart, you open a portal through which divine favor can flow freely into your life. Multiplication does not depend on the size of what you give or do but on the purity of the faith that accompanies it. A small act filled with trust can bring forth more blessing than a grand gesture done without belief. In the realm of the Spirit, nothing obedient goes unnoticed. God honors small beginnings because they reveal a heart willing to trust. When you obey a divine prompting, even something as simple as setting salt in a sacred corner, you are positioning yourself for multiplication. Your home becomes a fertile ground for blessings to grow. Peace multiplies, joy increases, and financial opportunities begin to emerge where once there was lack. The divine law ensures that what you dedicate in faith expands beyond your expectation. Divine multiplication also reminds us that prosperity is not random, it is a result of spiritual alignment. When your faith, words, and actions agree with divine principles, increase becomes inevitable. Just as a seed must be placed in the soil before it can sprout, your faith must be placed in action before it can manifest. Salt symbolizes preservation and purity, but when offered with faith, it also symbolizes multiplication, purity that multiplies peace, preservation that multiplies prosperity. What begins as a small, quiet act of obedience releases ripples of divine abundance throughout your life, transforming the ordinary into overflowing blessing. When spiritual principles are applied with genuine belief, transformation becomes inevitable. Faith that is acted upon releases a force that changes not only the external circumstances but also the inner atmosphere of the soul. Many hear divine truths, but only those who apply them with conviction experience their full power. The testimony of transformation always begins with a moment of revelation followed by an act of obedience. When a person takes a principle like placing salt in a sacred place and performs it with faith, something shifts within them and around them. The act becomes a point of contact between heaven and earth, where invisible grace touches visible reality. What once seemed ordinary now becomes extraordinary because it carries the energy of belief. Transformation is not only seen in the increase of wealth or the manifestation of prosperity but in the renewal of the spirit. When divine principles are honored, the atmosphere of the home changes. Peace begins to flow like a river, heaviness lifts, and a new clarity fills the air. This change is not by accident, it is the outcome of alignment between the human heart and divine order. Faith brings harmony to chaos and turns a home into a sanctuary of divine presence. Those who apply the principle of faith do not just attract blessings, they become channels of blessing. Their mindset shifts from scarcity to abundance, from doubt to confidence, from fear to peace. True transformation always begins in the unseen before it manifests in the visible. When you believe that your small acts of faith carry divine weight, you begin to walk in a higher dimension of awareness. The simple action of placing salt is no longer a ritual, it becomes a declaration that your environment is subject to divine authority. The more you live by this awareness, the more your surroundings begin to reflect it. Financial blessings begin to find their way, relationships are restored, and opportunities open without struggle. The atmosphere of your home becomes charged with gratitude, and your faith becomes magnetic to abundance. Those who have experienced this transformation often describe it as a quiet awakening. They realize that prosperity is not something they chase but something they attract through spiritual alignment. When principles are applied with unwavering faith, they ignite divine laws that cannot fail. The testimony that follows becomes proof of what faith can accomplish. Every word, every act, and every declaration begins to carry power. The transformation becomes evident not only in material prosperity but in peace of mind, strength of spirit, and the continuous flow of divine favor surrounding every area of life. Just as salt prevents decay in food, so does this act prevent decay in your spiritual and financial life. It marks a boundary, declaring that what is within your home is protected from spiritual contamination and negativity. As salt purifies, it also attracts divine favor, because purity always precedes prosperity. When you perform this prophetic act with sincerity and prayer, the atmosphere begins to shift, your spirit becomes lighter, and your environment aligns with the rhythm of abundance. The presence of salt in that sacred space becomes a constant reminder that God's cleansing power is active, that His covenant of provision is alive, and that your home is a vessel chosen to carry the overflow of divine prosperity. There are homes filled with wealth but empty of peace, homes filled with beauty but lacking joy, because the energy that flows within them is not anchored in divine harmony. But when faith-filled action takes place, when prayer and obedience merge, the atmosphere changes. It becomes lighter, calmer, more receptive to miracles. You can sense it in the air, in the way people speak, in how blessings start to flow without struggle. This is not superstition, it is spiritual law in motion. Energy responds to intention, and intention rooted in faith draws divine presence. When you invite divine energy into your home through faith-based acts like placing salt in a sacred place, you are declaring that this environment is no longer a battlefield of worry or fear but a sanctuary of grace. You are inviting the currents of heaven to move freely, to bring healing, prosperity, and restoration. It is not the salt alone that changes the atmosphere, it is the faith behind it, the spoken word, and the surrendered heart that open the door for the invisible hand of God to move through every room, touching every life, and turning ordinary spaces into places of divine abundance.